And so I want to encourage us to be stewards of our lives, be stewards of what God's calling us to do. If we don't, verse 18 will happen. Let's go back to verse 18. You're going to wear yourself out, and the people too. This job is too heavy a burden for you to handle all by yourself. We can have a clear sense of our calling, but if we're not wise or skilled stewards of what God's entrusted to us, we end up wearing ourselves out and wearing our people out. Now, I think for us, it's clear that God wants to use us. God wants to use you. He wants to use me. He wants to use us in the lives of the people around us, wherever we go. But we don't have to have the most flashy abilities to make the most of what God has entrusted to us by way of serving other people. We don't have to have all the flashy abilities or all the most talented skills to be able to use what God's given us for His glory in our life and in our ministry. You can start today doing just what God called you to do, and you and I can stop wearing ourselves out doing things we're not called to do or trying to do things we're not gifted to do. And this, for me, is a critical difference between Moses in Exodus chapter 17 and then Moses in Exodus chapter 18. Here in Exodus 18, Moses is actually being told by Jethro, I think by way of the Lord, Moses ends up putting all this into practice. Moses is being told by Jethro, hey, you're doing more than what God's called you to do, and you're going to need to help others do what God's calling them to do. But when you look at Exodus 17, it's a little bit different than that. Will you read Exodus 17 with me? There's Exodus 17, and I want you to just read verses 10 to 13 with me. So Joshua did what Moses commanded and fought the army of Amalek. And now these are the Amalekites, and this is the nation of Amalek, and they are in a battle with the children of Israel. All right? And so Joshua goes out, and he's the commander of the army, and he goes out and he fights. Meanwhile, Moses and Aaron and Hur climbed to the top of a nearby hill. As long as Moses held up the staff in his hand, the Israelites had the advantage. But whenever he dropped his hand, the Amalekites gained the advantage. Moses' arms soon became so tired he could no longer hold them up. So Aaron and Hur found a stone for him to sit on, and then they stood on each side of Moses, holding up his hands so that his hands held steady until the sunset. And as a result, Joshua overwhelmed the army of Amalek in battle. The only reason I want us to read just that section is because I think for some of us, we're going to need to learn the difference between Exodus 17 and Exodus 18. The difference between where you need help with what God's called you to do and where you need to help others do what God's calling them to do. And as we study this, I think Moses needed to learn that difference. It's not more than what God's calling us to do, not less than what God's calling us to do, but just what God's calling us to do. And I think that boredom happens when we're doing less than what God calls us to do. And I think burnout happens when we're doing more than what God calls us to do. You know, these weird sins that people in leadership end up committing, they might just be doing less than what God called them to do. When we're doing less than that, when we're not giving the full stewardship of all of our energy and resources to do what God calls us to do, I think we end up with a kind of boredom that really is a resultant sort of frustration in our life with the way things are turning out in our life. Have you ever felt that? I've felt that at times. Just a sense of frustration that things just don't go the way I want, and I don't even really know what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. This happens at times in seasons of all of our lives, and you know that might be a sign of just not having good clarity on your purpose and call, and then giving all of your stewarding all of your resources, your time, energy, and whatever margin you've got financially to do what God has called you to do, nothing more, nothing less. When we're doing less, it results in frustration. It results in sin, a kind of sort of playful sin or a kind of sin that satisfies the need to fill the time or even to fill the emptiness in our soul because we're doing less than what God's called us to do, less than what He has purposed for us. And then I think burnout is probably just a symptom of doing more than what He's called us to do. I've realized that in church planting, which, we're going to be 7 years old in September, it's possible in those early stages of church planting for all of us, not just me, all of us, many of us who are partners, longtime partners, to just do everything. Everything has to get done. But I think it's also been good for me to see and over the years try to put into practice that we can share the load by creating a healthy culture of hospitality, a healthy culture of leadership in the church, and even just embracing one another and serving together as a family. So seeing this less as an organization with things to get done and a family with people to care for. And that has helped us, I think, in the long run. But in a church plant setting or in a sort of new environment or a new ministry, it is possible to overwhelm yourself by taking too much upon yourself. This happens in a new family dynamic, doesn't it? You go from single to married, you're overwhelmed. Well, maybe I was, or maybe I overwhelmed Joanne. I'm sorry, babe. And you go into some new endeavor and you have your first child or something, imagining that, and it's just overwhelming. Or you get a new job and you go into it. It's possible because you want to please those people or because you have sort of an angst or a fear or something to just work yourself up and wear yourself out. And so I think we need to just take some time alone with the Lord to really discern how he's calling us and what he's calling us to do. And then I think there's a couple of other things. We're going to talk some more about this. The job, as Jethro tells Moses, is too hard to handle by yourself. It's too heavy for you. And I want you to see Paul. I envision Paul, and I can hear his words as he says it in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. Paul says, who is sufficient for these things? Who is able to do all that God is doing? In other words, I can't do all that I'm seeing, all that God is doing. He's sort of at the beginnings of the church and its expansion and saying that there's no way I can do this. But I want you to see the context of that verse. In 2 Corinthians 2, 12 to 13, it says, when I came to the city of Troas, this is Paul, I came to the city of Troas to preach the good news of Christ. Now he knows that God has called him to do that. The Lord opened a door of opportunity for me. When you have a purpose, and then God opens the door for you to fulfill that purpose, what do? You do it. But I want you to see something fascinating in verse 13. But I had no peace of mind because my dear brother Titus turned his cell phone off and I couldn't reach him. Can you imagine how stressful, even 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 2,000 years ago, how stressful it would have been to be like, where is Titus? If I showed up in Hampton Roads, I'd be like, okay, some tall buildings in Town Center, I'll start there. Where would you even find somebody? It's so stressful for me to think about it. I'm starting to get anxiety now, even just talking about it. How would I find my kids? How would I find my wife? It's crazy to think what life was like before we had cell phones. Okay, but he says here, but I had no peace of mind because my dear brother Titus hadn't arrived yet with a report from you. So instead of moving forward with the open door of opportunity, I said goodbye. And I went on to Macedonia to find him. The point I'm trying to make here is that Paul refuses to do ministry or to fulfill his calling alone. He refuses to do it alone. It's never good for anyone to be alone. And isolation, this is something else a mentor of mine shared with me, that isolation, it's not the worst thing we do, it's the way we do the worst things. And Paul refuses to do it. That's not just, it's never good for man to be alone, and that's not just sort of marriage advice. That's actually leadership advice. That's lifelong advice for anyone who wants to be a servant of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's what we are, a partnership in the gospel. This is not, the way I grew up understanding church was that if you wanted folks to get saved or to become a Christian, then your responsibility in the pews was to get other people to come to the pews, and then the person on the stage, it was his responsibility to share the good news and to lead them to Christ. So I'm wanting to change that paradigm a little bit and understand that actually all of us as partners in the gospel are called in a partnership together, working together so that each of us, and wherever God is calling us to do, is actually partnering in the gospel to share the gospel and to share our lives with people wherever God's calling us to do that. This is why we call it partnership and not really just membership. This is a partnership in the gospel. That's my hope and prayer for Anchor Church, that we would be a partnership in the gospel. It's not a partnership in our preferences. Like, well, I kind of prefer because they meet at the Sandler Center, or I kind of prefer that style of teaching, or I kind of prefer that kind of music. And if that ever changes, well, I'm going to go to another place where I prefer. That's not what, and it's okay if you prefer Anchor Church or something like that. I'm just saying that that's not at the top of the rubric for how you make a decision on what kind of community you're going to join yourself to. I think for us, if we want to be a part of Anchor Church and you're thinking about it, I want to partner together to care for each other, to make sure we look out for each other and love one another, and so that you have the trust in me and I have the trust in you that wherever I'm at, I'm a partner with you in the gospel, sharing the good news. And wherever you're at, you're a partner in the gospel, sharing the good news wherever you go. And where we get opportunity, we're going to try to do it together as a community to share and show the gospel to people in our community as a whole, as a collective unit. Do you see that? That's a partnership. That's a church. That's my prayer for us. And I think this is part of a takeaway for me as I'm studying what Jethro tells Moses. You're trying to do this all alone. And maybe that's some of our issue. We're trying to raise kids all alone. We're trying to fix our marriage all alone. We're trying to find a spouse all alone. We're trying to look for a job all alone. We're trying to identify calling all alone. We're trying to do everything we're doing all alone. I didn't want to be a part of starting a church to be alone. And we're inviting you to be a part of our church family, not so you can still be alone, but so that we can be family, so we can be together, so that we can carry one another's burdens, and so that we together can reach Hampton Roads together, not just with each other, but even with the other gospel-preaching churches in Hampton Roads. We're not meant to be alone. Anchor Church is not meant to be alone, and neither are you when we're together as Anchor.